Welcome to Charts Today. It is Wednesday, the 1st of July, a new quarter, a new half, and interesting seeing how markets are moving, and the picture's always changing. And one of the interesting things here, looking at the dollar index, is on that medium-term chart in June, we did activate an upside target. We've been sideways on the dollar for a good year, and actually just seeing that break a little bit higher is now making 12-month highs, 13 14-month highs, really significant. But if we look at the weekly chart, remember my work on time horizon, if you look at the weekly chart, then you can see that we are still sinking gradually. Currencies tend to react, they tend to take long-term trends, but we do see on medium-term charts that quite often it's a sideways move. But we are just seeing a little bit of dollar strength. If we look at the short-term 60-minute chart, we saw that move, but we have pulled back below the cloud. But you can notice the strength of that move, the pullback not so strong, and that is quite an interesting sort of pattern. And if we break above the cloud again, watch for targets there. Just highlights that you don't always get a target. So we are sort of short, medium term bullish on the dollar. And if we look at the euro, that has led to a medium term downside target for the euro. That's dollar strength, really. And if we look at the yen, we talked about this yesterday, making 40-year lows against the dollar, and hitting that 162.50 level. Really, this was the Bank of Japan intervening, and effectively it's a bit of a lost cause now. Looking at sterling, we see here that we've got could go either way for sterling, so quite interesting there. We are nudging, activating this downside target, dollar strength there, but we did have a big jump in sterling yesterday on the short-term chart, so it's not a foregone conclusion that we're going to these targets, but overall it's a case on that medium-term chart of watching that. And if we look at the weekly chart, we can see that we're actually nudging an upside target. So it's a very mixed picture for currencies, and that is often the case. Looking at Bitcoin, this has been more clearly bearish, and we can see here we've got downside targets on the chart, and we are testing new lows. That 58,000 level is really critical, and we can see on the short-term chart we've got downside targets there as well, waiting to see if we activate a new downside target that will turn from orange to red. And if we look at the long-term picture on Bitcoin, we are also below the cloud with a downside target to 36,000. A bit of a head and shoulders pattern showing up there, so that's quite key. That's one of the advantages on the lagging line. You often see a pattern that you don't quite see so clearly on the price itself. Looking at the Nasdaq, the long-term picture is very bullish, waiting to see if we activate an upside target. The medium-term picture is also bullish, but the short-term picture, we are just struggling to make a new high. We don't have any clear targets at the moment. Those little downside targets met. Looking at the futures today, we are down on the S&P, 1/3%, and the Nasdaq future down over 0.5%, so it does suggest that the US market will open lower. Looking at the UK market, we're also a little bit lower this morning, and the DAX in Germany just a little bit higher, so quite interesting there. India, we saw the Sensex recovering a little bit, but is still a pretty bearish chart on the medium term. And if we look at the Aussie market, the ASX 200, end of the tax quarter yesterday, end of the tax year in Australia yesterday, and if we look at the downside target there, quite a lot of inflationary worries in Oz at the moment. Brent crude was settling. We were neutral out to clients this morning, but we can see suddenly we've got a downturn there. That would really show up on the 1 minute chart and targets. So that is potentially good for the inflationary outlook for markets. 72 is a critical level. We're at 72.11 at the moment. There, sugar, a really big move there. Sugar, 6%. That's really interesting on that short-term chart, and we're into a new contract. And then if we look at the daily chart, we're sort of back above the cloud. We were above the cloud back in February, so it is interesting to see. This downside target will be deactivated with a move above 1550, so that's going to be quite key. And the long-term picture is still pretty bearish. You can see there we've got a lot of work to do to get into bullish territory, but that's a big move. Gold has been looking pretty bearish, and again that downside target given at 4500 has been met. If you look at the short-term chart, we can see the outlook there, and if we look at some of the other markets, just US 10-year yields, that has been really interesting. If we look at the daily chart on the 10-year, we are seeing interesting downside target. We're up 1% earlier today. This is a flag pattern and another flag pattern. And remember that all of these resources are on the updated website. So if you want to go and see patterns, these are the London Stock Exchange masterclasses I do under resources, and there's one on patterns, and you can watch that there, and I cover head and shoulders, etc. So those free resources are there on the website, so do check those out. Looking at the Mag 7, we were looking pretty strong yesterday. SpaceX was up 4%. Obviously on the daily chart we don't have a lot of data, but on the short-term chart we're starting to see a picture building, and of course these are on TradingView as well. I've got my SpaceX targets here, so watching on TradingView. This is actually the 5-minute chart, and we're sitting in the 170s, so recovering, but certainly need to hold that 150 launch price. And we are seeing just a pretty mixed picture. Looking at the Dow 30, one of the things I like to do is just rank. There are only 3 stocks that are bullish on all 3 trends. This is just my custom columns where I see bullish, bullish, bullish. There are 2 stocks that are really bearish, Disney and Nike. And that means that I can just home straight in on where the strength is. And we can see that with Caterpillar. Strong looking chart there on the short term, on the medium term, and on the long term. So that is a great way of homing in on the charts. And again, there's resources there. If you want to find that, you can go to articles and papers, and there's an article that I did on trend scoring, which was submitted to the American Association of Active Investor Managers, and you can read all about that there. So lots of things to follow. And then if we look at the UK market, we can take a quick look at the performance here. I've done my columns again this morning. I have these as custom columns. If you want to talk to our help desk, they can show you how to do these. And I've got my ranking. So we can see there are 100 stocks, of course, so there's many more than in the Dow, but we can see where the performance is, and that's where the strong performance is. And I do these columns on lots of things. So if I look at my energy mix, I've got my trends, my resistance and support levels, my target levels, all on my screen, read from the charts. A sort of little bit of AI, if you like, where it's actually reading the charts and putting those values into my screen. But that means that I'm ranked in terms of performance. So I'm going to find the strong performance in the UK market. Look at that long-term Coca-Cola. If we go to the medium-term charts, we will see that these charts all tend to be quite strong. NatWest is bullish on all 3 time frames, not quite as clear, which is why you still need to eyeball the chart. Hiscox's about to activate an upside target. Sergo also looking strong there. Admiral, we can see here also resistance to fight, but really quite key. Scottish Mortgage, another one. So it's just a way of finding where the strength is by ranking by those columns first off. that's it for today. Have a great day. Until tomorrow, happy charting. Bye for now.